Before we go into this riveting narrative, please let us know where you're watching from in the comments section. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe for more intriguing stories. A Christmas dinner like no other. I remember the night it all began as if it were yesterday. The city was alive with Christmas lights, their warm glow reflecting off the freshly fallen snow. People bustled through the streets, their arms filled with shopping bags, their faces lit with excitement. The scent of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon lingered in the air, mixing with the crisp cold of the December night. It was a scene straight out of a holiday postcard. But not everyone was basking in the festive spirit. It was the evening of Christmas Eve, and I had just finished my shift at the restaurant. I worked as the head server at La Lumiere, one of the most prestigious fine dining establishments in town. It was the kind of place where the elite dined, where crystal chandeliers cast a golden hue over white tablecloths, and where a single meal cost more than some people made in a week. That night, the restaurant had been fully booked for the annual Christmas Eve Gala, a private dinner hosted by Mr. Alan Whitmore, a self-made millionaire known for his generosity, but also his stern, no-nonsense demeanor. He wasn't the kind of man who entertained sympathy easily, but he did have a heart. One that, on that particular night, would be tested in ways none of us could have imagined. As I was locking up the side entrance, my fingers numb from the cold, I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old. She sat on the steps just outside the restaurant, curled up in an oversized coat that was torn at the edges, her tiny fingers gripping a thin piece of cardboard she must have been using as a shield against the cold pavement. Her cheeks were flushed red, her lips cracked, and her light brown hair was tangled beneath a knitted hat that was far too big for her. She wasn't begging. She wasn't crying. She was simply watching as guests walked out of the restaurant, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Watching as couples held hands, as children skipped along the sidewalk with their parents, and as the world moved past her, as if she were invisible. I hesitated. I had seen homeless people before. In the city, it was a sad reality. But something about this girl made me pause. Maybe it was the way she clutched her stomach when she thought no one was looking, or the way she bit her lip as she peered through the restaurant's grand windows, her eyes following the trays of roasted turkey, honey-glazed ham, buttered rolls, and steaming bowls of soup as they were carried to the guests. I took a step forward. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, my voice soft so I wouldn't startle her. She turned her head slightly, her wide brown eyes meeting mine. There was something in them, something deeper than sadness, a quiet resilience. "Are you lost?" I asked. She shook her head. "Are you waiting for someone?" Again, she shook her head. "Are you hungry?" This time, she hesitated before nodding. I looked around. The restaurant was closing, and I knew the kitchen was winding down for the night. If I had any spare cash on me, I would have handed it to her, but I had left my wallet inside. Then, as if by fate, Mr. Whitmore stepped outside. He was dressed impeccably in a tailored black coat, his silver hair neatly combed back. He adjusted his scarf as he surveyed the street before his gaze landed on me, and then on her. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in that deep voice of his, he asked, "What's going on here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but before I could, the little girl looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to see what Christmas looked like." I swear I saw something shift in Mr. Whitmore's eyes, but he quickly masked it, clearing his throat. "Where are your parents?" he asked. She didn't answer. For a long moment, there was only silence between the three of us. The city buzzed around us, cars honked, and people strolled by. But in that moment, it felt like we were in our own world. Then, against all expectations, Mr. Whitmore spoke. "Come inside." I blinked. Had I heard that right? The little girl looked up, unsure if he was serious. So was I. Alan Whitmore was not the kind of man to take in strangers. But there was something different about him in that moment. Something I couldn't quite place. She hesitated before nodding. I stepped aside, and Mr. Whitmore led the way into the grand restaurant, the warmth immediately wrapping around us like a welcoming embrace. As we stepped in, the last of the guests were leaving, and a few staff members were tidying up. The girl's eyes widened as she took in the tall Christmas tree in the corner, adorned with golden ribbons and twinkling lights. Her gaze drifted to the large fireplace, where stockings hung above the mantel. For a second, I saw something in her face, a brief flicker of joy. "Sit her down at a table," Mr. Whitmore ordered. I nodded, guiding her to a seat near the fire. She sat stiffly, as if unsure whether she was really allowed to be there. Mr. Whitmore turned to me. "Get her a plate of whatever's left in the kitchen." I hurried off, barely able to hide my shock. I wasn't the only one surprised. The other staff exchanged bewildered glances. This wasn't like him. When I returned, I placed a steaming plate of food in front of the girl, a generous portion of turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, and a warm bread roll. She stared at it for a long moment, her tiny hands trembling as she picked up the fork. Then she ate, slowly at first, then faster and faster. She ate like she hadn't had a meal in days. And maybe she hadn't. Mr. Whitmore stood nearby, watching. After a few minutes, he took a seat across from her, still silent. Finally, when she was halfway through her meal, he asked again, "Where are your parents?" This time, her small voice answered, "My mommy told me to wait for her, but she never came back." The restaurant was silent. My heart clenched, and for the first time in my life, I saw Alan Whitmore's expression change. It wasn't just concern. It was something deeper, something that, in all the years I had known him, I had never seen before. And then, as if by instinct, he did something that none of us expected. He reached across the table, and he took her tiny, trembling hands in his. Then he looked down, and that's when he saw it. The moment he saw her hands, his entire face paled, and in that instant, I knew everything was about to change. The scars that told a story. I have seen many things in my years working at La Lumiere. Grand celebrations, teary proposals, tense business deals, even a scandal or two whispered over expensive bottles of wine. But nothing could have prepared me for the way Mr. Alan Whitmore's face changed when he saw the little girl's hands. It was a flicker, so brief that anyone else might have missed it. A moment where his usually stoic expression cracked, revealing something deeper, something more haunted. His lips parted slightly, his eyes narrowing in what I can only describe as a mix of recognition and disbelief. The little girl, she hadn't even noticed. She was too busy swallowing her food, gripping the fork tightly as if someone might snatch it away from her at any second. But I saw it. I saw the way her hands trembled, how her fingers were lined with small, deep scars, and how her knuckles were rough, cracked, and bruised. They weren't the hands of a child who had simply fallen while playing in the snow. No, they were the hands of a child who had survived something terrible. The warmth of the restaurant suddenly felt suffocating. The crackling fire, the twinkling Christmas lights, it all felt too cheerful, too mismatched for what was unfolding before us. Mr. Whitmore finally released her hands, but his voice had lost its usual firmness. "Where did you say your mother went?" The little girl, still chewing, shrugged slightly. "She told me to stay by the bakery down the street. She said she'd come back for me." I glanced at Mr. Whitmore. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "How long ago was that?" He pressed. She wiped her mouth with the sleeve of her oversized coat. 2 days. A deep silence fell over the room. Even the few staff members still lingering stopped moving. 2 days. She had been waiting in the cold alone for 2 entire days. My stomach twisted. Mr. Whitmore exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw as if trying to process what he had just heard. Then, after a long moment, he did something I never thought I'd see. He stood up and took off his coat. Not in an impatient, dismissive way. No, he removed it carefully, deliberately, before stepping behind the girl and gently placing it over her shoulders. "It's too cold to be outside like that," he muttered. She froze, staring at the coat as if she had never been given something so warm, so kind. And that was the moment I saw it. The way Mr. Whitmore looked at her, not with pity, but with something heavier. I knew then that this wasn't just about some Christmas charity. This was personal, a past that refused to stay buried. After the little girl had finished eating, Mr. Whitmore did something even more shocking. He sat back down. Not in his usual way, where he loomed over people with quiet authority. No, this time, he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. His gaze was locked onto the girl, as if he were trying to see past her small frame, past her tangled hair, past those scared little hands, to something deeper. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing between him and me. "It's okay," I assured her gently. Finally, she answered. "Emma." It was such a small name. So simple, so delicate. Yet, for some reason, when she said it, I saw something flash in Mr. Whitmore's eyes. Something painful. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected it. "And your mother?" he asked. "What's her name?" Emma bit her lip. "Her name is Clara." The moment the name left her mouth, Mr. Whitmore's entire body tensed. His hand, resting on the table, curled slightly into a fist. His shoulders stiffened. And that was when I knew. He recognized the name. I had been working for Mr. Whitmore for years, and in all that time, I had never seen him show much emotion beyond the occasional irritation when a dish wasn't up to his standards. But this was something else. I wanted to ask. I wanted to know what he was thinking, but the atmosphere was too tense, too fragile, like a glass about to shatter. Then, just as suddenly as the tension had come, he stood up. "We're leaving." I blinked. "Sir." He turned to me. His voice was firm again, but there was an edge to it. "I need to find her mother." The search for Clara. I don't know what I expected that night, but I certainly didn't expect to find myself walking through the city beside my millionaire boss and a little homeless girl wrapped in his coat. The streets were quieter now, the Christmas rush dying down. Snowflakes fell softly, catching in Emma's tangled hair as she led the way toward the bakery where her mother had last left her. "She said she'd be back before night," Emma murmured as we walked. Mr. Whitmore didn't respond. He just kept walking, his jaw tight, his hands shoved into his pockets. When we arrived, the bakery was dark, its doors locked. Emma pointed to a small corner near the entrance, where the pavement was slightly shielded from the wind. "I waited there," she said. My chest ached. She must have been freezing. Mr. Whitmore looked around, scanning the area. Then, without warning, he turned to me. "Find out where the nearest shelters are." I nodded, quickly pulling out my phone. It took a few calls, but I finally found a shelter that had seen a woman matching Clara's description. A young mother, thin, exhausted, with brown hair like Emma's. "She was here last night," the shelter worker said over the phone. "She came in looking desperate, but she left before morning. She said she had to go back for something." I relayed the information to Mr. Whitmore. His expression remained unreadable, but I saw the way his hands clenched. He knew something. Something about Clara. Something about Emma. And as we walked back toward his car, Emma clutching onto the sleeves of his coat, I had the feeling that whatever was coming next was going to change everything. A past that refused to stay buried. The sound of our footsteps echoed against the quiet streets, the snow crunching beneath our shoes. The city was settling into the stillness of Christmas Eve night, but for us, the night was just beginning. Emma clung to the oversized coat Mr. Whitmore had draped over her small fingers gripping the sleeves like they were her only tether to warmth. She walked beside him, her pace quick but cautious, as if she wasn't used to someone actually leading her somewhere safe. I followed closely behind, my mind racing with questions I couldn't bring myself to ask. There was something about the way Mr. Whitmore carried himself, a stiffness in his shoulders, a sharpness in his gaze. It was as if the name Clara had unlocked something inside him, something buried beneath years of carefully built walls. And now, those walls were cracking. We reached his sleek black car parked along the curb. Normally, Mr. Whitmore was particular about who he allowed inside his vehicle. But tonight, he opened the door and gestured for Emma to get in without hesitation. The little girl hesitated, her gaze flicking between us. I don't have money. My heart twisted. She thought this was a transaction. Before I could reassure her, Mr. Whitmore spoke. I'm not asking for money. Emma hesitated for another second before climbing in, pulling the coat tightly around herself. Once we were all inside, Mr. Whitmore gripped the wheel, his fingers tightening for a split second before he started the engine. The car purred to life, the heat blasting instantly, filling the space with warmth. I studied him as he pulled onto the road, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He wasn't just taking her to a shelter. No, there was something personal about this, and I was going to find out what. The weight of an old debt. We drove in silence for several minutes, the only sound coming from the faint Christmas music playing through the radio. I stole a glance at Emma in the back seat. She sat stiffly, her eyes darting between the glowing streetlights outside and the man driving the car. Then, finally, she spoke. Do you know my mom? Mr. Whitmore didn't react immediately, but then he let out a slow exhale. Yes. I felt my chest tighten. So I was right. Emma tilted her head. You do. Mr. Whitmore didn't answer right away. His grip on the wheel tightened, his jaw clenched slightly. After a long pause, he said quietly, A long time ago. A long time ago. I frowned. I had worked for Mr. Whitmore for nearly a decade. In all those years, I had never heard him mention a woman named Clara. Who was she to him? Emma shifted slightly in her seat, her small hands curling into fists. She wouldn't just leave me. She promised she'd come back. Her voice was so small, so full of something that made my heart ache. Mr. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror, watching her. She might have had a reason, he said carefully. Emma bit her lip. Like what? Silence. Mr. Whitmore didn't answer. Because he didn't know, or because he did. A shelter, a lead, and a truth too painful to say out loud. We pulled up outside the shelter, a modest brick building with a flickering neon sign that read Hope Haven Shelter. The parking lot was empty except for a few cars, and the windows glowed softly with yellow light. Emma stared at the building, her small frame suddenly tense. She was here, she asked. Mr. Whitmore nodded. Emma swallowed. Then why didn't she take me with her? Neither of us had an answer to that. As we stepped inside, the warmth hit us immediately. The shelter was simple but welcoming. Rows of chairs lined the lobby. A few people huddled under blankets, and a Christmas tree stood in the corner, its decorations sparse but earnest. A tired-looking woman at the front desk glanced up as we approached. Can I help you? She asked. Mr. Whitmore stepped forward. We're looking for a woman named Clara. She was here last night. Recognition flickered across the woman's face. Yeah, I remember her. She came in real late, looked like she hadn't slept in days. She was desperate, kept asking about someone she left behind. Emma's breath hitched. The woman frowned. She didn't stay long, though. Left before dawn. Said she had to go back. Go back where? Mr. Whitmore asked, his voice sharper now. The woman hesitated. She didn't say, just that it was dangerous. A cold chill ran down my spine. Dangerous. Emma looked up at us, her small fingers clutching the edge of Mr. Whitmore's coat. Where is she now? She whispered. The woman sighed. I don't know, sweetheart. But she was scared. Really scared. Scared? Mr. Whitmore's jaw tensed. He knew something, and I was done waiting for answers. I turned to him. Sir, "Who is Clara to you?" His gaze was unreadable, but when he spoke, his voice was quiet. "She's someone I owe a debt to." I blinked. A debt. He exhaled slowly, his fingers rubbing against his temple. "A long time ago, Clara saved my life." Silence fell between us. Emma's breath caught. "My mom, she saved you." Mr. Whitmore nodded. "Yes, and I never repaid her for it." The weight of his words settled over us like a heavy blanket. He wasn't just helping Emma out of pity. He was righting a wrong. And whatever that wrong was, it had haunted him for years. The next step. The shelter didn't have any more answers, but it didn't matter. Because now Mr. Whitmore was determined. He turned to Emma. "I'll find her," he promised. There was something in his voice, something unshakable. Emma looked up at him, her brown eyes searching his face. And then, for the first time since we found her, she nodded. Because somehow, she knew too. If there was anyone who could bring her mother back, it was him. The ghosts of Christmas past. I will never forget the way Mr. Alan Whitmore looked that night, the way his usually unshakable demeanor cracked, if only for a second, when he spoke Clara's name. I had worked under him for years, and not once had I seen the man falter. He was a self-made millionaire, a man who built his empire with ruthless precision, whose business dealings were as sharp as the suits he wore. He was respected, feared, a man who owed no one anything. And yet here we were, standing in a dimly lit shelter, the warmth of Christmas flickering weakly through a worn-out tree in the corner, while a fragile little girl in his coat looked up at him with wide, desperate eyes. And for the first time, I saw the weight of a debt unpaid pressed down on the great Alan Whitmore, a name that meant everything. Emma tugged on the coat wrapped around her small frame, her fingers curling around the edges like she was afraid someone would take it away. "My mom saved you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Whitmore nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yes." I watched him carefully. There was a story here, one buried so deep it had taken a starving little girl on the streets to dig it up. And now, I needed to know. "How?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual. Mr. Whitmore's eyes flicked to me, then back to Emma. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he exhaled. 17 years ago, I wasn't always rich. His voice was different now, lower, almost distant. Emma blinked. "You weren't?" Mr. Whitmore shook his head. "No. When I was younger, I had nothing." I stared. The idea of him, the man who owned one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, the man who wore tailored suits and drove luxury cars, being broke felt impossible. But I didn't interrupt. "I was barely scraping by," he continued. "I was drowning in debt, out of work, and too proud to ask for help. I had lost everything I built, and I was living out of my car." Emma's small fingers twitched, gripping the sleeves of his coat tighter. "It was winter," Mr. Whitmore went on, his voice quieter now. "Christmas Eve." My heart clenched. Christmas Eve, just like tonight. I was starving. I hadn't eaten in days, he admitted, his jaw tensing, as if the memory itself shamed him. I went to a small diner, thinking maybe I could steal leftovers off a table when no one was looking. But before I could, someone stopped me. His fingers curled slightly against the counter. A waitress, a girl no older than 20. She had nothing, barely making minimum wage, and yet she put a plate of food in front of me and told me to eat. I sucked in a breath. Clara. Emma's lips parted. That was my mom. Mr. Whitmore nodded slowly. She didn't know who I was, didn't ask questions. She just said, "No one should be hungry on Christmas Eve." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. She fed me that night, let me sit inside where it was warm, gave me the only extra food she had, and told me things would get better. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. But I never saw her again after that. I frowned. "You didn't go back." His expression hardened. I was ashamed. I froze. I told myself that one day when I was back on my feet, I would find her, repay her kindness. But I got busy. I let the years pass. And eventually, I stopped looking. Regret flickered in his eyes, an emotion I had never seen on him before. And then, finally, he turned to Emma. And now, all these years later, I find her daughter, alone, starving, on Christmas Eve. Silence. A heavy, unbearable silence. Emma's lower lip quivered. Then she whispered, "You think she's in trouble, don't you?" Mr. Whitmore didn't answer right away, but his silence was answer enough. The search begins. The shelter didn't have any more leads, but we weren't giving up. I don't know what I expected, but I certainly didn't expect to find myself sitting in Mr. Whitmore's car as he barked orders into his phone. "I need you to find a woman named Clara, last seen near Hope Haven Shelter. Get me surveillance footage from nearby streets, bank transactions, whatever you can find." The response on the other end must have been hesitant because Mr. Whitmore's tone turned sharp. "I don't care what it takes. Just find her." I exchanged a glance with Emma, who was sitting quietly in the back seat, watching him with something I couldn't quite place. She wasn't just scared. She was studying him. "Why do you care?" she finally asked. Mr. Whitmore's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I told you," he said. "I owe your mother a debt." Emma shook her head. "No, that's not why." Mr. Whitmore's eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and unspoken. Finally, Emma said, "It's because you know what it's like to be left behind." The car went completely silent. My breath caught. Emma didn't say it like an accusation. She said it like she understood. Like she recognized something in Mr. Whitmore that she had seen in herself. For a long time, he didn't respond. Then finally, he murmured, "Yeah, maybe I do." A call in the dark. Just when I thought the silence would stretch on forever, his phone rang. He answered immediately. "Talk." I couldn't hear the other end of the conversation, but I saw the way his face changed. The way his usually unreadable expression hardened. And then, "Where?" A pause. Then he threw the car into drive so fast, I barely had time to grab onto my seat. Emma's eyes widened. "You found her." Mr. Whitmore's jaw was tight. "I found something." His hands clenched the wheel. "And I don't like what I'm hearing." The urgency in his voice sent a chill down my spine. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. And as we sped through the dark, snow-covered streets, only one thought pounded in my head. What had Clara gotten herself into? A Christmas promise. The car cut through the cold, empty streets like a blade, its headlights slicing through the falling snow. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of something none of us fully understood yet. Emma sat in the back seat, gripping the edges of Mr. Whitmore's coat, her wide brown eyes darting between us as the tension in the car grew. I had never seen my boss like this before. Alan Whitmore was a man of control, a man of precision. But tonight, his hands were tight on the wheel, his knuckles white, his breath measured in a way that told me. He was afraid. And if he was afraid, then whatever we were heading toward was something far worse than I'd imagined. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "What did they say?" I demanded. Mr. Whitmore's jaw clenched. "She was spotted near an abandoned warehouse on the east side." A warehouse. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. "Why would she be there?" I asked. He exhaled sharply. "Because that's where people go when they have nowhere left to run." I shivered. Nowhere left to run. Emma sat up straighter. "Is she okay?" He didn't answer. Because he didn't know. The warehouse. The car screeched to a halt in front of a dark, looming building at the edge of town. It stood like a forgotten skeleton against the snow, its windows shattered, its metal doors rusted from years of abandonment. Mr. Whitmore was out of the car before the engine even finished rumbling. "Stay here," he ordered. Emma immediately ignored him and climbed out after him, and I followed suit. The three of us moved through the snow-covered ground, each step careful, deliberate. The air was thick with silence, but not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes before something bad happens. Then, a noise, a soft, ragged cough. Mr. Whitmore stopped dead in his tracks. I saw it the second he did. A small, curled-up figure sitting against the cold concrete wall, barely visible in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Her hair was matted, her coat tattered, her body shaking violently from the cold. "Clara!" Emma gasped. "Mom!" She tore forward before we could stop her. "Emma, wait." But the little girl didn't hesitate. She ran straight into her mother's arms, collapsing against her as if she had finally found the only thing that had ever felt like home. Clara let out a sharp, choked sob, her trembling hands wrapping around her daughter, pulling her close, as if she were afraid she might disappear. "Oh, baby," she whispered, her voice cracked from the cold, from exhaustion, from 1,000 nights of suffering. "I'm so sorry." Emma clung to her. "I knew you'd come back." Clara broke. Tears spilled down her face, silent, raw, painful. And then, Mr. Whitmore moved. For the first time since we'd met him, he knelt. He knelt down in the snow, lowering himself to her level, and Clara finally looked up at him. The second her eyes met his, everything stopped. Recognition flooded her features. Shock. Disbelief. Then something even deeper. Something wounded. "You," she whispered. Mr. Whitmore's lips parted, but no words came out. Clara swallowed hard. "I thought." She exhaled, shaking her head. "I never thought I'd see you again." For a long time, they just stared at each other. A lifetime separated them. But debt wasn't what connected them anymore. It was regret. And for Alan Whitmore, a man who had spent his life paying back debts, repaying favors, building an empire of calculated transactions, this wasn't something that could be measured. This was something else entirely. Something human. Finally, his voice came, rough and unsteady. "I should have looked for you," he admitted. Clara blinked. He swallowed. "I should have found you years ago." Clara let out a breathy, broken laugh. "Yeah, you should have." Then she reached up, slowly, cautiously, and took his hand. And in that moment, I saw it. The wall he had spent years building, crumbling. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to see the man he used to be. Enough to see the man he could have been. And perhaps the man he could still be. A Christmas unlike any other. We took Clara back with us that night. Mr. Whitmore had an extra guest room in his estate. He insisted she stay there. Emma fell asleep almost instantly, curled up in a warm bed for the first time in whom knows how long. Clara, however, stood in the doorway of the room, staring down at her daughter with a look I had never seen before. Relief. Hope. Fear. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. Mr. Whitmore, who had spent his entire life dealing in currency and favors, simply said, "You already did." Clara looked up at him, her lips parting in surprise. He met her gaze, and for the first time, I saw true regret in his eyes. "You saved me once," he said. "It's only fair I return the favor." Clara swallowed hard. She nodded. And just like that, the weight of years lifted. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to start over. Enough to heal. As I stepped out into the hallway, leaving them alone, I glanced back one last time and saw Emma, half asleep in bed, still wearing Mr. Whitmore's coat. And for the first time that night, I smiled. Because that little girl wasn't just a street child anymore. She was home. And for the first time in a long time. So was he. The end. A story of redemption. A story of second chances. This story isn't just about a debt repaid. It's about the fact that sometimes the people we leave behind don't stay in the past. Sometimes they find us again. And when they do, we have a choice: to ignore them, or to finally say the words we should have said long ago. This Christmas, Mr. Alan Whitmore made his choice, and in doing so, he didn't just save Clara and Emma. He saved himself.